The whispers stopped abruptly as David Mitchell stepped through the doorway. 20 pairs of eyes locked onto his tailored charcoal suit, a stark contrast to the man they thought they knew. The single father who'd been scraping by, who drove a 15-year-old sedan with mismatched doors, now stood before them looking like he belonged on Wall Street. What they didn't know was the sacrifice behind that suit, or how it would change everything by the end of that meeting. If this story already has you wondering what happens next, hit that like button and subscribe to see more incredible true stories of ordinary people facing extraordinary moments. David adjusted his tie nervously, feeling the weight of their stares. The boardroom of Westlake Elementary School had never felt so intimidating, not even when he'd first attended a PTA meeting 3 years ago, a newly widowed father with no idea how to navigate his daughter Emma's education alone. Mr. Mitchell, Principal Harrington recovered first, gesturing to an empty chair. Please join us. We were just discussing the fundraising shortfall for the new playground equipment. David nodded, taking his seat while trying to ignore the continued glances. The suit felt foreign against his skin, too smooth, too perfect. His calloused hands, stained with motor oil that never quite washed away, seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Thank you for having me, he said quietly, his voice steadier than he felt. Rebecca Wilson, the PTA president whose husband owned half the real estate in town, leaned forward with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. That's quite a transformation, David. Special occasion? There was something in her tone, curiosity mixed with judgment, that made his spine stiffen. 3 years of being looked down upon by parents like Rebecca had taught him to recognize the subtle digs, the implications that he didn't quite belong in their circle. You could say that, he replied, offering nothing more. The meeting proceeded, but the tension remained. David listened as they discussed the $15,000 shortfall for the playground renovation. The current equipment was outdated and unsafe, but the fundraising efforts had fallen short despite months of bake sales and car washes. Perhaps we should consider scaling back the project, suggested Rebecca. We could eliminate the accessible equipment section and save nearly $8,000. David's jaw tightened. Emma didn't need the accessible equipment, but her best friend Lily used a wheelchair. He'd watched how the current playground isolated her, forcing her to sit on the sidelines while other children played. Actually, David spoke up, his voice cutting through the murmurs of agreement, I'd like to cover the shortfall. The room fell silent again, this time with a different kind of shock. All of it? Principal Harrington asked, clearly skeptical. David nodded, reaching into his inner pocket and removing a check. He slid it across the table, the amount clearly visible to everyone nearby. Rebecca's eyes widened. I don't understand. How could you possibly? Things change, David said simply. But things hadn't changed, not in the way they assumed. 6 months earlier, David had been working his usual double shift at Mitchell's Auto Repair, the small garage he'd inherited from his father. It barely kept a roof over their heads after his wife Sarah's medical bills had drained their savings before cancer took her life. The garage was failing, unable to compete with the larger chains that had moved into town. That night, a sleek black Mercedes had pulled in just as he was closing. The driver, an elderly man named Harold Winters, had a simple problem, a flat tire, but no one else would help him so late. While David worked, they talked. Harold mentioned he was in town visiting his granddaughter who attended the local university. David shared stories about Emma, now 8 years old and thriving despite everything they'd lost. You've done well by her, Harold had said, watching David work with efficient movements. Not many men could handle what you have. David had shrugged. You do what you have to for your kids. Before leaving, Harold handed David a business card. I'm looking for someone to manage my collection of vintage automobiles. Someone who understands cars but, more importantly, understands value. Think about it. David had tucked the card away, assuming nothing would come of it. But 3 weeks later, when the bank threatened foreclosure on both his home and the garage, he'd made the call. Harold's collection turned out to be one of the most prestigious private automobile collections in the country. The job offered triple David's current income, but required relocating to Boston, over 3 hours away. For weeks, David agonized over the decision. Moving meant uprooting Emma from the only home she'd known, away from her friends and the memories of her mother. Staying meant certain financial ruin. The suit had been Harold's idea. For the school meeting, he'd said, after David explained his concerns about the move. "Sometimes, David, you need to look the part before people will listen to what you have to say." Now, sitting in that boardroom, David felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him along with everyone's stares. "I'm selling the garage," he explained, his voice steady despite the emotion building in his throat. "And I've accepted a position managing an automobile collection in Boston. We'll be moving at the end of the month." The announcement was met with stunned silence. Principal Harrington was the first to recover. "That's wonderful news for you and Emma, though we'll certainly miss you both." Rebecca seemed less convinced. "So sudden. And what about Emma?" "Uprooting a child mid-year can be traumatic." David had anticipated this question. "Emma and I have discussed it extensively. It wasn't an easy decision, but it's the right one for our future." What he didn't say was how he'd sat with Emma night after night, talking through every aspect of the move. How they'd cried together over leaving the house where her mother's presence still lingered in every corner. How they'd made lists of pros and cons, and visited Boston twice to see the new apartment and school. "The donation," David continued, "is my way of giving back to a community that supported us through the hardest time in our lives. I want other children to have a playground where everyone can play together, including kids like Lily." The mention of Emma's friend shifted the atmosphere. Several parents nodded in understanding, some looking slightly ashamed of their earlier judgment. After the meeting, David stood in the parking lot beside his battered old car, the expensive suit creating a strange juxtaposition. He loosened his tie, finally able to breathe. "David, wait." He turned to see Rebecca approaching, her designer heels clicking on the asphalt. "I owe you an apology," she said, surprising him. "I've misjudged you." "We all have." David shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." "No, we do. When Sarah died, we all said we'd be there for you and Emma, but most of us just paid lip service to the idea. We saw you struggling and kept our distance, as if hardship was contagious." Her honesty was unexpected, and David found himself at a loss for words. "The donation was incredibly generous," she continued, "but it's not about the money. It's about what you prioritize. While we've been arguing over fundraisers and committee positions, you've been focused on what really matters, making sure all children have a place to play together." David thought about Emma and how she'd insisted they couldn't move until they knew Lily would have a proper playground. His 8-year-old had more wisdom than most adults he knew. "Emma's the generous one," he admitted. "She made me promise we'd help before we left." Rebecca smiled, a genuine one this time. "She's an extraordinary child. But children learn by example." As David drove home that night, the expensive suit jacket hanging in the back of his weathered car, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The past 3 years had been a crucible, burning away everything but what truly mattered. He'd lost his wife, nearly lost his business and home, and now was leaving the town where he'd spent his entire life. Yet somehow, he felt richer than ever before. Emma was waiting up for him, curled on the couch with a book, fighting sleep. Her face brightened when he walked in. "Did they like the check, Dad? Will Lily get her playground?" David scooped her up, book and all, marveling at how someone so small could have such an enormous heart. "They loved it, Em. Construction starts next month. But we won't be here to see it," she said, a hint of sadness in her voice. "No, but we'll come back to visit. And you know what? There are other playgrounds that need help too. Maybe that can be our thing wherever we go, making sure every kid has a place to play." Emma considered this, her small face serious in contemplation before breaking into a smile. "I'd like that." Later, after Emma was asleep, David carefully hung up the suit. He'd return it tomorrow. It had been a rental, the one extravagance he'd allowed himself for this occasion. The money for the playground had come from selling the garage, setting aside just enough to make this one final contribution before they left. Harold had offered to buy him a suit as a signing bonus, but David had declined. He didn't need expensive clothes to know his worth anymore. That afternoon in the boardroom had taught him something important. Respect wasn't found in the fabric of a suit but in the fabric of character. As David Mitchell and his daughter left town the following month, they didn't leave behind much in terms of material possessions. But they left something far more valuable, a playground where all children could play together, and a lesson about what truly makes a person wealthy. The whispers that had stopped when David entered that meeting in his expensive suit had transformed into something else by the time he left town, stories of a man who had nothing but gave everything, who understood that true wealth isn't measured by bank accounts but by the lives you touch and the legacy you leave behind. And as for David and Emma? Their new beginning in Boston was just the first chapter in a story that would continue to inspire others. Because sometimes the richest people are those who have learned what really matters, and it's never the price of the suit you wear, but the heart beating beneath it. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring true stories that remind us of the extraordinary courage found in ordinary lives. Sometimes the most powerful transformations happen when we're faced with our greatest challenges, and like David Mitchell, discover strength we never knew we had.